Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back, way back, to the gentle dawn of civilization. Long before any frantic morning rush or the harsh glow of your refrigerator light. Tonight, we are easing into the deep past, focusing entirely on the slow, repetitive comfort of making the world's first truly excellent bread. We are going to explore the soothing process of creating Neolithic sourdough bread. You find yourself standing not in a brightly lit, sterile kitchen, but in a small, cozy space built from packed earth and rough timbers. The only light filtering in comes from a small opening high up, or maybe a flickering oil lamp casting long, gentle shadows that seem to dance only when you blink. You are surrounded by the simple tools and the comforting, dry scent of raw grain. You probably believe that humans have always eaten fluffy, uniform loaves sliced perfectly straight, but the reality of early bread was much tougher, flatter, and frankly, a bit sadder. It took a long, patient time to discover this beautiful, airy sourdough method we are about to explore, turning simple cooked grain into something complex and truly divine. Before you get too comfortable and possibly fall asleep halfway through, tap like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this odd mix of boredom and history. It keeps the channel alive and the stories just sleepy enough to help you drift off again next time. If you're watching, let me know your location and the local time right now. It is always comforting to see how many people around the world are sharing this quiet moment with us. Now, dim the lights. Let the world outside grow quiet, and turn on a fan if you like that soft, steady hum in the background. Let your shoulders loosen and your breathing slow. This is your time to drift. No rush, no deadlines, no noise. Just you, a little warmth in the air, and the faint whisper of history waiting to unfold. So, settle in, and let's ease gently into tonight's journey together. Your first task, before any actual bread making can begin, is the preparation of the grain itself. You reach for the ancient, dried stalks of einkorn wheat, one of the earliest domesticated grains, long before the varieties you see in modern fields. The stalks feel dry and brittle in your hands, making a soft, whispery sound as you gently slide them onto the woven mat spread before you. This is the sound of thousands of years of human persistence, a slow, quiet achievement. You begin to separate the edible kernels from their protective husks. This ancient process, called threshing, is repetitive and calming. You use a sturdy, flat piece of wood to lightly beat the dried stalks. It is not a harsh, violent action, but a measured, rhythmic tapping, a soft thud against the mat, designed only to persuade the tiny kernels to release their grip. Each gentle strike releases a fine, invisible dust into the quiet air, catching the faint light and swirling slowly down, adding to the dry, earthy scent of the room. This process takes a long time, but there is no hurry here. Time is fluid and plentiful. You watch the small pile of grain slowly grow, each kernel a potential loaf, a promise of warmth and sustenance. Once the kernels are separated, you have to sort and clean them. You pour the newly threshed grain into a wide, shallow basket made from reeds. You lift the basket and, with a slow, deliberate movement, begin to winnow the grain. You gently toss the grain into the air just slightly, letting the lightest breeze, or maybe just the air disturbed by your own slow movement, carry away the lighter, unwanted chaff and bits of dust. The heavier, precious kernels fall back into the basket with a soft, settling rattle. This separation requires focus, but the action itself is deeply meditative. You watch the small, unwanted husks float away on the quiet air currents, carried to the corner, where they will be swept up later. The sound is a delicate, continuous shower as the grain gently slides and settles. This is the kind of quiet work that makes the mind feel smooth and uncluttered. You watch the pile in the basket transform, becoming cleaner, denser, and more uniform, ready for the next slow step. Now comes the hard, physical work, the grinding. But even this is done at a pace that invites peaceful thought. You have two large stones. The lower stone, called the quern, is flat and deeply set, resting solidly on the earth. The upper stone, the handstone or mano, is smaller and rounded, designed to be held and moved across the surface. You scoop a handful of the cleaned grain and gently pour it onto the surface of the lower stone. The grains are small and hard, making a dry, tiny scattering sound as they land. You take the handstone and begin to move it across the grain in a slow, circular motion. The friction between the two stones is not loud or jarring. It is a continuous, deep scratch sound. The sound of stone working patiently against stone. This grinding is the true heart of the labor. You must push and pull with a gentle but firm pressure. The grain must be broken down, layer by layer, from a hard, stubborn seed into a fine, light powder. It does not happen quickly. Your arms fall into a heavy, continuous rhythm, a slow, deep rotation that is almost hypnotic. The motion is tiring, certainly, but it is a steady, predictable sort of fatigue that doesn't feel frantic or stressful. It is the honorable exhaustion that comes from good, necessary work. A fine, pale dust begins to puff up around the edges of the stones, settling like a layer of soft snow on your hands and the nearby surfaces. This is your flour, the essence of the labor. You pause for a moment, letting the handstone rest heavily on the lower stone. You feel the deep, steady ache in your shoulders, a good grounding sensation. You remember that this tool, the simple hand, quern or saddle quern, was the most common form of grain processing for thousands of years. It was the backdrop noise of most Neolithic homes. That continuous, gentle scratch, the sound of daily life and survival. It is such a common, fundamental piece of history that historians still argue whether the grinding was primarily done by older women, or if the duty rotated among all members of the household. It is a quiet debate about the rhythms of ancient domestic life, something we can only imagine now, sitting here in the quiet. You realize you must grind, not just enough for this one loaf, but enough to last for a few days, maybe a week. You continue the slow, mesmerizing rotation. You are not thinking about your phone or tomorrow's schedule. or any minor modern irritations. Your mind is absorbed entirely by the feel of the stone under your palm, the steady pull and push of your muscles, and the slow, visible transformation of hard grain into soft flour. There is a deep, primal satisfaction in this visible change, a slow reward for sustained effort. You add another small handful of grain, listening to the new batch crackle under the weight of the handstone. And the rhythm begins anew. The final flour that emerges is not like the flour you know today. It is whole grain, certainly, but it is also much coarser, containing fragments of the husk and the bran that the rough stone could not fully pulverize. This gives it a slightly darker color and a much denser texture, but it also carries a deeper, nuttier flavor. You scoop the pale, weighty flour with your hands, gathering it into a large, simple clay bowl. The clay is cool and smooth to the touch, and the flour settles inside with a comforting, dry whisper. The amount is substantial, the result of a long, quiet effort. Now that the flour is ready, you move to the second, equally crucial component, water. You step out of the cozy earth dwelling, feeling the cool, still air of the Neolithic evening. The light is fading gently, painting the sky with soft, muted colors. You walk a short, familiar path toward the local water source, perhaps a quiet stream or a communal well. You carry a simple, sturdy earthenware jar. Your bare feet make a soft pad sound on the well-worn earth path. The journey is part of the preparation, a necessary pause between the physical effort of grinding and the patient, waiting game of fermentation. When you reach the water source, the air is cooler and damper. You kneel by the edge, the ground feeling cool and damp beneath your knees. You dip the jar carefully into the slow, moving water, listening to the gentle, continuous glug as the water rushes in, displacing the air. The water is clear and cold, and you can feel the slight chill through the rough clay of the jar. You lift the now heavy jar slowly, steadying it with both hands. This water, fresh and alive, will bring the ground grain to life. As you walk back, you consider a little known fact about early civilization, long before people worried about dental hygiene. One of the first known forms of toothache relief involved applying warm fig paste directly to the aching tooth. It is a quirky, fringe tidbit that reminds you just how much of ancient life was centered on natural remedies and simple, available ingredients. It is a funny thought to carry back into the quiet warmth of your dwelling. Once inside, you gently set the heavy water jar down. The light from the oil lamp seems warmer now, reflecting off the dark wood and pale clay. The scent of the freshly ground flour is strong and earthy. You are now prepared to begin the true magic of the process, the creation of the levain, or the wild starter, which will give the bread its special lift and tangy flavor. This is the moment where human intention meets the gentle power of the natural world, a very patient, slow partnership that will define this ancient loaf. This quiet gathering of ingredients is the prelude to the much longer waiting game that lies ahead, a time filled with soft sounds and the slow unfolding of microscopic life. Everything is still, ready for the next step. The flour and the water now sit together in the quiet dwelling, cool and still, waiting for your instruction. The long effort of grinding has settled into a comfortable memory, leaving a residue of fine, pale dust on the workbench and your hands. You move toward a smaller, clean clay bowl, a vessel specifically set aside for this first, delicate step, creating the wild starter. This step, the heart of the sourdough process, relies entirely on the invisible life floating all around us, a gentle collaboration with the atmosphere. You measure out a small, precise scoop of your freshly ground einkorn flour. It is not an exact science, but an intuitive judgment, the kind of knowledge passed down through quiet demonstration rather than noisy instruction. You place the flour into the small bowl. It settles with a soft poof of air, a light, dry sound. Next, you add a carefully measured amount of the cold, clear stream water. You pour it slowly from the jar, making sure not to splash. The water hits the flour, and immediately the texture changes from dry powder to a heavy, pale paste. You take a simple wooden mixing stick, maybe just a smooth, clean branch that has been carefully polished by years of use. You begin to stir. This mixing is not hurried, it is a slow, methodical folding motion. You scrape the sides of the bowl gently, drawing the wet and dry parts together. The sound is a thick, continuous squelch as the wooden stick moves through the heavy, wet mixture. You watch the paste transform into a smooth, thick batter, slightly sticky and uniformly gray, white. This new mixture is the starter, or the levain, and it is entirely dependent on the air itself. You are relying on the unseen yeasts and bacteria that live naturally on the flour particles, on the air currents, and perhaps even in the water you collected. This is why Neolithic bread making was a matter of deep patience and environmental awareness. There are no tiny packets of commercial yeast here, no instant gratification. You must wait for the wild, invisible life to awaken. You place the small bowl containing the starter mixture in a warm, quiet corner of the dwelling. You cover the top gently with a thin piece of woven cloth, allowing air to pass, but keeping dust away. The gentle smell of damp grain and fresh earth surrounds it. The location you choose is key. It must be warm enough to encourage the invisible organisms to wake up, but not so hot that it kills them. You know from quiet experience that a spot near the glowing coals of the hearth, even when the fire is low and banked, is often the most peaceful and productive place. Now the waiting begins. This waiting is one of the most soothing parts of this entire ancient rhythm. You are waiting for nothing more dramatic than tiny, living organisms to begin consuming the starch in the flour and gently exhale carbon dioxide gas. You might check on it once the next day, leaning down gently. You use your nose first, smelling for the slightest hint of tang, a soft, sour note that signals life. Then you look closely. You are looking for the smallest, most timid sign of activity, a tiny bubble, a slight increase in volume. For the first day, there is usually nothing much to see. The mixture just sits, heavy and still. This patience is a profound lesson the Neolithic world teaches the modern mind. You are learning to trust the slow, predictable processes of nature. You simply move on to other quiet tasks, perhaps preparing food, or sorting stored grains, or gently cleaning the smooth stones of the hearth. All the while knowing this small bowl is quietly, slowly coming to life. On the second or third day, a subtle change begins. When you lean down, you smell it. A soft, acidic scent, not harsh, but pleasantly tangy, like overripe fruit or gentle vinegar. You look closer, and there they are, tiny, lazy bubbles beginning to break the surface. They pop softly, almost imperceptibly, releasing that faint, acidic perfume. This is the moment of confirmation. The wild yeast has begun its work. Now the feeding begins, another slow, comforting routine. Twice a day, at the quiet morning and evening times, you gently stir the existing mixture. The stirring feels lighter now, the texture slightly more airy. The sound is a soft, wet splut as the bubbles are disturbed. Then you add equal parts fresh flour and fresh water, gently stirring them in. This is the feeding ritual. It provides new fuel for the growing yeast population. The mixture swells gently, becomes lighter, and starts to smell stronger, more pleasantly acidic over time. This slow, dedicated care is what gives the bread its distinctive, delicious taste. A curious fringe tidbit of history suggests that some very early cultures believed the starter culture was literally blessed by the moon or the night air, because the processes of fermentation seemed to happen magically while they slept. It is easy to understand why they felt that way, watching the bowl quietly breathe and grow in the darkness. The feeding continues for many days, maybe 5, maybe 7, maybe even 10, depending on the temperature and the vitality of the local wild yeasts. You watch as the starter becomes vigorous, easily doubling in size after each feeding, its surface alive with a peaceful, gentle bubbling. When you stir it, the mixture feels elastic and airy, no longer heavy paste but a light, active foam. The smell is tangy, comforting, and deeply complex. The smell of slow, natural change. This vibrant, active mixture is now ready to become the levain for your main dough. You take a moment to look closely at the active starter. You understand that this fermentation process, the fundamental chemical change that turns starch into acids and gas, is a mainstream historical fact that completely revolutionized early human existence. It made grain, the staple food, far more digestible and nutritious. Without this long, patient discovery, true agriculture and large settlements might never have flourished. It is a quiet foundation for the whole world you inhabit. There is a charming quietude to this waiting period. You have finished the hard labor of grinding, and now you are engaged in the soft labor of patience. You listen to the quiet hiss of the banked fire nearby, the gentle, low sound of burning embers settling in for the night. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the darkness behind your lids feel warm and soft. You are surrounded by the simple, earthy sense of your life. Dry grain, wood smoke, and the pleasant, tangy perfume of the active starter. You think about the fact that historians still argue whether the discovery of leavened bread was an intentional scientific experiment or a magnificent, happy accident. Did someone forget a bowl of grain paste in the corner for a few days, and then, noticing the bubbles and the tangy smell, decide to risk baking it? Or was it the result of slow, quiet, repeated observation by generations of patient cooks? It is a peaceful debate, one that doesn't require a hurried answer. The result is the same, the gentle gift of airy bread. As the days turn over and the starter matures, you become attuned to its quiet needs. If the dwelling grows slightly cooler, the starter slows down. If it becomes warmer, the activity increases. You are learning the subtle relationship between time, temperature, and life. You find yourself moving the bowl slightly closer to the hearth on cold mornings and pulling it back into the cooler earth shadow during the warmth of the midday sun. This quiet attentiveness is the secret ingredient of this ancient recipe. Finally, the starter is ready, vibrant, bubbly, and beautifully aromatic. You take a larger bowl, the one that will contain the entire final dough. You scoop out a generous portion of the active starter, placing it gently into the large bowl. The sound of the sticky starter separating from the smaller bowl is a soft, wet slop. The remainder of the starter you will keep feeding, maintaining it as an ongoing, living tradition, ready for the next time you bake. The care of this continuing starter, sometimes called the mother dough, is a comforting daily task, a constant, quiet hum of domestic life. Into this main bowl, you now gently add the rest of the freshly ground einkorn flour. You pour it slowly from the storage container, watching the fine powder gently blanket the wet starter. The two main elements are now united. The final step before the deep work of kneading is the addition of the remaining water and, crucially, a tiny bit of salt. Salt in the Neolithic era was a precious commodity, often sourced from distant coastal evaporation ponds or mineral deposits, making its use in food a careful, deliberate choice. You sprinkle the fine, bright white salt over the mixture. The salt is sharp and dry against the pale flour. You pour in the final measure of water, again slowly and deliberately. The scent of the flour and the tangy starter is strong now. You pause, looking down at the shaggy, rough mass of flour, starter, water, and salt. This is the moment where the ingredients must be brought together into one cohesive, living mass. You feel a quiet anticipation for the long, repetitive motion that is about to begin, the deep, satisfying rhythm of the knead. The air in the room is still, waiting for the gentle work to commence, ready to transform this rough mixture into a smooth promise of warmth and comfort. The process is slow, peaceful, and entirely focused on the deliberate action of your hands. The room feels grounded and calm. The shaggy mass sits heavy in the large clay bowl, a rough mix of flour, water, salt, and the bubbly, fragrant levain. Now begins the deep, satisfying labor of the knead, a rhythmic action that is less about power and more about gentle, consistent repetition. You move the bowl from the workbench to a solid, low stone slab that serves as your kneading surface. The heavy bowl makes a dull, settling sound as you place it down. You first scrape the rough mixture from the bowl onto the smooth, cool stone. The dough is sticky and clings stubbornly to the sides, requiring a patient coaxing with a wooden scraper. The noise is a soft, wet-check against the clay. The dough lands on the stone surface with a heavy, wet thump. It is cold and uncooperative at first, resisting cohesion. This is the moment when you must gently convince the flour to give up its secrets, to release the protein strands that will become the structure of the loaf. You dust the stone surface lightly with a pinch of the remaining einkorn flour, using just enough to prevent sticking, but not so much that it dries out the dough. Then you begin the motion. You push the dough away from you with the heel of your hand, stretching it slightly, and then fold the far edge back over itself. You turn the mass a quarter, turn and repeat, push, fold, turn. The initial sound of this work is a wet, messy slap squish as the dough fights the movement. It is heavy, damp, and tears easily. The rhythm starts slowly, matching the steady pace of your breathing. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. Your hands become covered in the sticky mass, the Neolithic equivalent of modern kitchen gloves being, well, nothing. You feel the cold dampness of the dough against your skin. This is the simple, direct connection to the food you will eat. You realize, vaguely, that this is why kneading is so often described as deeply therapeutic. It forces your mind into a single, simple, continuous cycle. As the minutes pass, the texture begins its slow, marvelous transformation. The dough starts to feel less like a heavy, fragmented sludge and more like a cohesive, slightly elastic body. The sound changes too. The wet squish becomes a deeper, quieter thwomp as the mass holds its shape better. You are building gluten, the invisible meshwork of protein that traps the carbon dioxide gas produced by the yeast, giving the bread its final airy structure. You are fully immersed in the rhythm now. Push, fold, turn. The light from the oil lamp flickers gently, casting soft, blurry movement on the walls. The air is still, save for the soft sound of the dough meeting the stone and the gentle, slow inhale and exhale of your own breath. You lose track of time in this steady, hypnotic cycle. Your mind wanders to quiet, simple thoughts. The texture of the soft moss outside, the gentle sound of the stream, the warmth of the banked hearth. This repeated action must continue for a very long time, much longer than a modern recipe would demand, because this ancient flour is not as highly refined, and the action must be patient to develop the strength needed. You must continue until the dough transforms from a rough, sticky mass into a smooth, pliable, almost silken ball. You push, fold, turn, feeling the dough resist slightly, then stretch and smooth out. It is during this quiet, long period of kneading that you consider a mainstream historical fact. Wheat was first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, in regions like modern-day Turkey and Iraq, roughly 10,000 years ago. This domestication was one of the single most important events in human history, allowing nomadic groups to settle and leading directly to the development of complex societies, all because of the humble grain you are now patiently transforming. The longer you knead, the warmer the dough becomes from the friction and the heat of your hands. It gains a deep, satisfying elasticity. When you pull a small piece and stretch it slowly, it now forms a thin, translucent sheet without tearing immediately. This is the window pane test that bakers still use today, an ancient sign of well-developed gluten, proving your long, quiet efforts have been successful. The dough ball finally sits smooth and round on the cool stone, its surface soft and slightly tacky, but no longer clinging desperately to your hands. It looks and feels alive, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. You scoop up the smooth, warm ball of dough and place it back into the large, clean clay bowl. The dough rests in the bowl with a quiet, solid plop. You now begin the first, short rest period, the time known as autolyse or bulk fermentation, depending on the timing. For this initial rest, you simply cover the bowl with a clean, damp cloth. The cloth makes a soft, damp sound as you gently lay it over the rim. The gentle humidity trapped beneath the cloth will prevent the surface of the dough from drying out and forming a tough skin. This rest is crucial. Even though you have stopped kneading, the fermentation work does not cease. The yeast continues its patient, microscopic labor, slowly producing gas and flavor, and the gluten you built is relaxing and spreading out evenly. The dough is, in essence, settling in for its first gentle nap. During this quiet, waiting period, your eyes catch a glimpse of the simple tools around you. You reflect on a quirky historical tidbit. In some early European Neolithic cultures, bread, or at least the raw dough, was sometimes used not just as food, but also as a form of simple, temporary currency or a medium for social exchange before metal coinage was common. Imagine paying your neighbor with a beautiful, heavy ball of dough, a trade based entirely on skill, labor, and the promise of future nourishment. As you sit patiently, allowing the dough to rest, you feel the need to gently turn and fold the dough a couple of times over the next hour or so. This technique, the stretch and fold, is a quiet method of strengthening the dough without the harshness of the initial full knead. You simply wet your hand and slide it under one edge of the dough, lifting the edge gently and folding it over the center. You turn the bowl a quarter, turn and repeat, moving slowly around the bowl. This action, done maybe 4 times, is silent and gentle, giving the dough a tiny burst of air and promoting even temperature distribution. The dough still feels cool from the stone slab and firm from the kneading, but you can feel it slowly softening and relaxing. You consider the final piece of quiet contemplation for this section. Historians still argue whether the earliest forms of yeast used for leavening bread were also the primary source of yeast used for brewing beer in the same ancient communities. Were the same microscopic life forms responsible for both the daily meal and the nightly refreshment? It is a peaceful uncertainty. a reminder that the boundary between food and drink was blurry and beautifully organic in the Neolithic world. The second and third stretches and folds happen in the gathering dusk. The lamplight is softer now, and the shadows are deeper and longer. Each time you handle the dough, it feels smoother, more elastic, and slightly warmer. The initial cold resistance is gone, replaced by a warm, yielding malleability. You can almost feel the gentle thrum of the microscopic life within, the quiet, tireless engine of fermentation. You complete the final stretch and fold, gently tucking the edges of the dough under itself to form a neat, round ball again. You listen to the soft, heavy settling sound as the ball finds its place in the center of the bowl. You cover it once more with the damp cloth. The work of heavy labor is done. Now, the longest and most important waiting game is about to begin, the long, slow, deep sleep of the bulk proof. You step back, letting the smooth, quiet darkness envelop the resting dough, ready for its long slumber in the warmth. The air is calm, the work is complete, and the stage is set for the slow, internal transformation. The dough now rests in the large clay bowl, snugly tucked beneath its damp cloth covering. The heavy labor of grinding the einkorn and the rhythmic pressure of the initial kneading have passed. You are now entering the phase of bulk proofing, the longest, quietest, and most essential part of making this ancient loaf. This is pure patience, a lesson in letting go and trusting the unseen forces. You move the bowl to its designated spot for this long rest. This spot is carefully chosen, usually an insulated area where the temperature remains steady and gently warm, perhaps nestled deep within a woven basket and covered with thick, heavy furs or woven mats. The heavy wrapping helps to stabilize the temperature, ensuring that the wild yeasts maintain their slow, continuous work without getting chilled or overheated. You handle the bowl gently, placing it down with care, making a soft sha sound as the furs settle around the clay. The air inside the dwelling is quiet and still. The only sounds are the occasional soft tick of the cooling hearthstone and the almost imperceptible internal fizz of the dough itself. You know that inside that resting mass, billions of yeast organisms are quietly multiplying, consuming the sugars in the flour, and most importantly, releasing carbon dioxide gas. This gas, trapped by the strong gluten network you developed during the long knead, is what will give the bread its ultimate structure and lightness. During this deep, long rest, the dough is not just expanding. It is developing its entire character. The lactic acid and acetic acid bacteria that live alongside the yeast are working slowly, patiently building the complex, tangy flavor that gives this bread its name. Sourdough. This process is entirely non-dramatic. You cannot rush it, you cannot yell at it, and you cannot force it. You simply surrender to the slow, gentle timeline of fermentation. This bulk proofing might last many hours, sometimes even overnight, allowing the subtle cold of the Neolithic air to work its magic and deepen the flavor profile. You check the dough only occasionally, lifting the heavy fur covering just enough to glance inside. always mindful not to disturb the temperature too much. You are looking for a gentle, slow expansion. The dough should look domed and soft, no longer heavy and dense, but puffy and buoyant. You gently tap the side of the clay bowl, listening for a slight hollow sound, a gentle thud that confirms the interior is filled with tiny, silent air pockets. You remember the feeling of the dough when you first mixed it. Cold, sticky, and fragmented. Now it is transforming, becoming warm, smooth, and full of quiet energy. This transformation is a mainstream historical fact. The control of fermentation, whether for bread or for brewing, was a massive leap for early civilization, providing reliably preserved food and making grain, the staple, far more palatable and digestible than simple porridge. This quiet bowl holds the potential for reliable, shared sustenance. You allow your mind to drift back to the quiet of the room. You consider a quirky historical tidbit. In some regions, early bakers would try to seed their starter or dough by adding things like grated apple or grape skins. Believing the visible, fruit held the powerful magic of fermentation. We now know that the powerful wild yeasts are simply everywhere, on the air and on the grain husks. But the gesture of adding a piece of fruit, a small, sweet sacrifice, was a quiet ritual of hope and anticipation. It speaks to the mystery and wonder that this invisible process must have held for those early bakers. As the hours pass, you notice the dough has visibly swelled. It has doubled its volume, or perhaps increased by 50 or 60%, looking like a large, pale bubble settling gently in the bowl. It feels lighter when you gently touch the rim of the bowl. When you look closely at the surface, you can see tiny, lazy bubbles occasionally break, releasing that signature soft, sour perfume into the still air. The fragrance is comforting. A blend of wet earth fermentation and a deep promise of baked warmth. The long, quiet proofing time is also a period where historians still argue whether the earliest loaves were actually set aside intentionally for a long proof, or if the process was naturally integrated into the slow rhythm of the day. Perhaps the dough was mixed in the morning and then simply left until the evening fire was ready. Was the long proof a careful, understood technique, or simply the natural result of life, moving at a much slower, more deliberate pace? It is a gentle debate about the intentions of silent, long ago hands. You realize that this long wait is where the true beauty of this ancient baking lies. It requires no effort, only restraint. You are not physically working, but you are still deeply involved in the process, listening to the quiet of the room and feeling the stillness of the environment. You might spend this long, quiet waiting period engaged in other slow tasks, perhaps weaving a mat, carefully sharpening a flint tool, or simply sitting near the banked fire, watching the embers glow and listening to the soft, rhythmic hiss of the cooling ash. The tranquility of the Neolithic night settles fully around the dwelling. The cool air outside creates a perfect counterpoint to the gentle warmth where the dough rests. You feel a deep, grounding connection to this quiet process. In a world with few instant comforts, the slow, predictable transformation of grain into dough offered profound certainty and peace. You remember the dense, unyested flatbreads that came before this discovery, simple mixtures cooked quickly on hot stones. Those were mere survival. This sourdough is culture, comfort, and quiet culinary elevation. You imagine the feeling of the dough now. It is deeply fermented, full of flavor, and lightly acidic. The surface is stretched taut, and the entire mass trembles slightly if you nudge the basket. It is at its peak readiness. The bulk proofing is complete. The dough has taken its long, deep nap and is now awake and ready for its final shaping. The last gentle handling before the immense heat of the hearthstone awaits. The time for waiting is over, and the time for final, focused action is about to begin. You feel a quiet sense of readiness, knowing that the most delicate, final steps of the process are next, leading toward the warmth and satisfying weight of the finished loaf. The long, quiet hours of the bulk proof have passed, and the dough is now fully rested and deeply fermented. You reach gently for the covered bowl, feeling the satisfying lightness of the mass beneath the cloth. The dough has swelled, looking like a large, pale cloud that has settled comfortably into the clay vessel. The gentle, tangy aroma of the levain is strong and comforting as you uncover it. You now prepare the surface for the delicate process of shaping the loaf. You clear away any stray flour or dust from the cool stone slab where you previously kneaded. This time, instead of dusting the stone with flour, you might gently moisten it with a tiny amount of water, or simply work on a very clean, smooth section to ensure the dough retains its final shape without sticking harshly. The dough is now too delicate for vigorous kneading. The shaping must be precise, gentle, and fast. You reach into the bowl, sliding your wet hand carefully underneath the buoyant mass. You lift the dough slowly, avoiding any abrupt movements that might deflate the precious, trapped air bubbles. The dough pulls away from the clay with a soft, sticky smooch sound, landing heavily and softly on the cool stone. It immediately relaxes and begins to spread slightly under its own weight, a sign of its beautiful, relaxed state. The goal of this shaping, or pre-shaping, is to create tension on the surface of the dough, essentially tightening the skin to give the loaf structure and control its rise in the oven. You begin by gently pulling the edges of the dough toward the center, forming a rough, round mound. This is not kneading. It is gentle persuasion. You use the sides of your palms, making soft, sweeping motions to tuck the dough under itself. The sounds are hushed and soft. A light swish against the stone as you gently move the mass. You rotate the dough slowly, working your way around the edges, tightening the surface tension until you have a smooth, almost perfect ball, or boule. This shape is held together entirely by the surface tension of the gluten you built during the long knead. You step back for a very brief rest, perhaps 5 or 10 minutes, called the bench rest. You cover the bowl gently with the damp cloth again. This brief pause allows the gluten network which you just tightened, to relax slightly so that the final shaping does not tear the surface. While the dough rests, you recall a mainstream historical fact: the widespread adoption of specific oven types, like the domed earth oven or taban, dramatically increased the quality of bread, allowing for a much more even and intense heat than simply baking on a hot stone. The slow evolution from flat, tough bread to airy, domed loaves was tied directly to innovations in quiet, patient thermal engineering. After the short, quiet bench rest, the dough has relaxed and spread slightly, losing some of its initial tension. You gently uncover it and prepare for the final, most careful shaping. This final form will be the one that goes into the intense heat. You handle the dough with extreme care, determined to preserve the internal structure, those countless tiny air pockets you nurtured during the long proof. You might choose to shape it into an oval, or batard, or a slightly flattened round for stability on the ancient hearthstone. If shaping a round, you repeat the tucking motion, pulling the edges carefully toward the bottom center and sealing them gently. If shaping a batard, you roll the dough gently, folding the top third down to the center, the bottom third up to the center, and then folding it in half lengthwise, sealing the seam softly with the heel of your hand. This seals the precious gases inside. The sound of this sealing is a soft, continuous shosh as the tacky dough welds itself together. The final shaped loaf sits ready, perfectly smooth on top, with the sealed seam tucked neatly underneath. It is firm, elastic, and feels wonderfully light and active. This loaf must now undergo its final rest, the final proofing or second fermentation, and this must happen in the vessel it will be baked in, or in a basket that mimics that shape. This final rest will make the dough light enough to rise beautifully when it hits the heat. You reach for a basket, maybe one woven from reeds and heavily lined with a fine linen cloth, or simply dusted with a thick layer of flour. This vessel, the banneton of the Neolithic world, supports the dough during its final expansion. You gently lift the loaf and place it, seam side up, into this prepared basket. The dough settles into the weave with a soft, sighing sound. This final proofing is often done in a slightly cooler place than the bulk proof, perhaps in a still, shaded corner of the dwelling, to slow the fermentation right down. Slowing the yeast action here is important because it allows the dough to gain strength without expanding too quickly and losing tension. This final, quiet wait might take another few hours. You cover the basket gently with a clean cloth. The quiet patience of the dough is mirrored by your own calm stillness. You think about a quirky historical tidbit. In some early communities, special markings were sometimes scored into the surface of the loaf before the final proofing, not just for decoration, but as a form of identification. A quiet, symbolic signature to ensure the baker received their own loaf back from the communal village oven. A simple cross, a zigzag line, or a series of quiet dots acted as an ancient, edible receipt. As the dough rests, you begin the slow, deliberate work of preparing the oven. You realize that historians still argue whether the Neolithic people in different regions all used the same hearthstone baking technique, or if enclosed clay ovens, like the early tanner, developed independently in multiple places almost simultaneously. Was it convergent invention driven by the need for better bread? It is a peaceful academic riddle that has no immediate impact on the quiet loaf resting before you. You let the dough rest, watching the gentle light outside deepen and soften, an image of pure, quiet anticipation. The loaf is almost ready to receive the warmth that will complete its transformation, turning the promise of flavor into the reality of food. The shaped loaf is resting in its basket, undergoing its final, slow proof, a quiet prelude to the heat. While the dough slowly readies itself, you must now focus entirely on the ancient art of fire and thermal management. The process of building the heat and preparing the hearthstone oven. This requires slow, deliberate action and a deep understanding of wood and stone. You move toward the central hearth, the heart of the dwelling. It is a simple structure, a shallow depression in the floor lined with smooth, thick stones. One stone, the largest and smoothest, is designated as the baking stone. This stone needs to reach a profound, sustained heat to bake the dense, wild, yeasted loaf properly. You begin by carefully placing small, dry kindling into the hearth pit. These are thin, brittle sticks that snap with a quiet, sharp sound when you gently break them to size. You build a small, neat pyramid, allowing plenty of space for air to move. You then gather larger, seasoned pieces of hardwood, wood that will burn slowly and steadily, producing intense, long-lasting heat, not harsh, quick flames. The wood feels dry and rough in your hands, making a dull, soft clatter as you stack it. You reach for the fire starter, maybe a simple piece of flint and steel, or perhaps just a glowing ember, carefully preserved from the previous night's fire, tucked away in dry ash. You gently coax the ember to life by blowing on it softly. The sound is a low, continuous huff, huff, a gentle breath that coaxes the heat. The ember begins to glow brighter, a small point of intense orange in the dark material. You transfer this tiny ember to the kindling. Immediately, a thin wisp of smoke rises, smelling sharp and clean. Then, a small, tentative flame appears, licking gently at the dry wood. The fire is born. The sound of the new fire is a low, gentle, continuous crackle and hiss as the heat begins to break down the wood fibers. This fire must now be nurtured and allowed to grow slowly. You add the larger pieces of hardwood, one by one, carefully building the blaze until it is fully established and roaring, but contained entirely within the hearth area. The light in the dwelling changes, becoming intensely warm and dancing, throwing sharp, dramatic shadows on the walls and ceiling. The heat begins to radiate outward, chasing away the damp chill of the earth walls. The goal is not just to burn the wood, but to heat the heavy baking stone beneath the flames to a very high, even temperature. This thermal mass will act as the oven. For a long, quiet period, you tend the fire, making sure the flames, dance evenly over the entire surface of the stone. The sound of the fire becomes a steady, comforting roar, the sound of profound, transforming energy. You are immersed in this warmth, watching the wood slowly turn into glowing, incandescent ash. You recall a mainstream historical fact: the early use of fire for cooking, especially for baking, fundamentally changed human anatomy and brain size. Cooking food, particularly grains, makes them far easier to chew and digest, allowing early humans to extract more energy with less effort. This slow, quiet fire you are tending is not just for warmth, it is a profound catalyst for human development. As the fire reaches its peak heat, the stones in the hearth become nearly white, hot, glowing with absorbed energy. You wait until the wood has almost entirely collapsed into a bed of deep, glowing red coals and ash. Now, the quiet, precise work of clearing the oven begins. You take a long, sturdy wooden implement, perhaps a simple paddle or a curved stick. You gently push all the remaining glowing embers and white ash from the surface of the baking stone to the sides of the hearth. This is done slowly and deliberately, avoiding any harsh scraping that might damage the smooth surface. The movement of the wood against the hot stone creates a soft, continuous sweep sound, and a gentle cloud of fine, warm ash dust rises, smelling intensely of wood smoke and heat. Once the baking stone is completely clear, it glows dark red and radiates intense, dry heat. This heat is perfect. You might take a simple measurement, perhaps sprinkling a tiny pinch of flour onto the center of the stone. If the flour instantly blackens or bursts into flame, the stone is too hot. If it slowly turns golden brown and gently smokes, the temperature is perfect. Hot enough to instantly set the crust, but gentle enough to cook the interior slowly. You now realize that the delicate, final moments of the dough's life must be handled with care. You gently retrieve the loaf from its basket. You flip the basket over onto the smooth, clean wooden peel. The ancient, flat paddle used to slide the loaf into the oven. The loaf is carefully released, now seam side down, displaying its smooth, taut upper surface. Before placing it in the oven, you must score the loaf. You take a very sharp piece of obsidian or flint, or perhaps a carefully sharpened stick. This scoring is essential. It is a shallow, deliberate cut into the surface of the dough, often a simple straight line or a quick cross. This cut acts as a controlled tear, directing where the gas expands during the sudden burst of heat. Without this, the crust would burst open violently and unevenly. The blade makes a soft, quick shock sound as it slices gently through the skin of the dough. You pause for a final moment, looking at the prepared loaf. You consider a quirky historical tidbit. In some early Germanic cultures, the anstich, or scoring of the bread, was sometimes performed with a ritualized gesture to ward off bad luck, a simple, quiet acknowledgement that the success of the bake was never fully guaranteed. The quiet act of scoring carried deep symbolic weight. The prepared loaf rests on the wooden peel. You now use the peel to slide the loaf onto the incredibly hot stone. You move the peel quickly but smoothly, making a flat, horizontal motion to set the dough down and immediately pull the peel back out. The sound is an immediate, deep sizzle as the wet bottom of the dough hits the searing hot stone. This is the start of the oven spring, the rapid, dramatic rise of the dough as the internal moisture instantly turns to steam and pushes the gluten structure upward. You watch, transfixed, as the loaf swells quickly, bursting open along the controlled score line, expanding into its final, beautiful shape. Now, the final, longest quiet wait begins. The bread is baking directly on the heat source, relying on the intense thermal mass of the stone and the gentle residual warmth of the hearth area. You gently move a few of the glowing coals back toward the edges of the stone, ensuring a sustained, even heat for the long bake. You realize that historians still argue whether the discovery of the controlled oven spring, the use of intense heat to achieve maximum rise, was understood scientifically or just observed as a result of using a super hot stone. Was the science of steam pressure truly grasped, or was it simply the quiet mastery of technique? It is another peaceful uncertainty in the history of human ingenuity. You settle in for the long bake, watching the loaf slowly transform in the flickering firelight. The air is warm, dry, and soon a new, magnificent scent will begin to fill the dwelling. The loaf is baking. It rests on the searing baking stone, bathed in the residual, dry heat of the cleared hearth. The frantic energy of the oven spring, that initial burst of upward expansion, has subsided, replaced by the slow, continuous transformation of moist dough into dry, firm bread. This stage requires the deepest patience, relying entirely on time and sustained heat. The first, most immediate change is the color. The pale, smooth surface of the loaf, which was creamy white when it entered the heat, begins to turn a light, gentle gold. This is the start of the Maillard reaction, the complex chemical process where amino acids and reducing sugars react under heat, creating hundreds of new flavor compounds. You watch the color deepen slowly, moving from pale gold to a rich, warm brown. This change is visible and dramatic, yet it unfolds with profound slowness, teaching you to appreciate the long arc of a process. The scent is the most magnificent element of this waiting. Initially, there was only the smell of wood smoke and hot stone, but now a new, warm fragrance begins to permeate the entire dwelling. It is the deep, nutty scent of toasted grain mixed with the complex, slightly sharp, tangy aroma of the sourdough acids. The pleasant smell of thousands of years of fermentation. The scent moves gently on the still air, filling every corner, a deeply comforting, primal smell that signifies sustenance and safety. You are listening closely to the sounds of the bake. Occasionally, you hear a soft, dry pop or ping, the sound of the crust cooling rapidly as it dries out, fracturing slightly in its final, hardened form. These are the small, quiet sounds of the bread's completion. You resist the urge to open the heat source or touch the loaf, knowing that any disruption would release the precious internal heat and slow the baking, yielding a dense, sad loaf. You settle near the hearth, letting the dry, immense heat wash over you. You realize that this moment of quiet, intense heat is a mainstream historical fact. The ability to generate and control high heat was essential not only for food, but for early metallurgy and ceramic production. The patient mastery of fire was the invisible bedrock of all Neolithic technological advancement. Yet right now, it is simply focused on turning the core of this loaf into something soft and nourishing. The total baking time is long, perhaps an hour or even more, due to the density of the whole grain einkorn flour and the residual heat of the open hearth method. You must trust the process, guided only by the deepening color and the richness of the fragrance. You observe the loaf, noting a quirky historical tidbit. In some early agricultural communities, the top crust of a perfectly baked loaf was sometimes thought to carry protective or sacred properties, and it was often the first piece broken off and consumed or shared with the village elders. The simple, quiet crust was not just food, but a carrier of tradition. As the final minutes pass, the aroma peaks. The loaf is deep brown, its scored surface beautifully opened, displaying a paler contrast where the dough burst upward. The time is right. You reach for the long, wooden peel, carefully sliding the flat end underneath the intensely hot loaf. The peel scrapes softly against the baking stone. With a smooth, gentle motion, you lift the heavy, finished loaf from the heat. The sound of the peel lifting the bread is a deep, satisfying thud, the solid weight of success. You gently slide the loaf onto a clean, flat surface, perhaps a wooden board, or a cool, clean stone. The heat radiating off the loaf is intense, almost shocking in its intensity. The loaf must now rest, and this is another crucial, quiet waiting period. You hear the final, immediate sound of the bake, the singing of the crust. As the loaf is removed from the oven, its super-heated crust begins to cool and contract, releasing soft, continuous crackle sounds, a quiet, acoustic testament to its structural integrity. This cooling period is essential. The internal temperature of the bread is still very high, and if you cut into it now, the steam would escape too quickly, yielding a gummy, wet interior. You must wait patiently until the internal temperature stabilizes. This can take another hour or more. You place the loaf in a safe, still place, listening to the soft, gentle crackle and pop of the cooling crust. You consider the final piece of quiet contemplation. Historians still argue whether the transition to settled farming, which this bread represents, led to a net improvement in health for early humans, or if relying on a single starchy food source, like einkorn, actually caused earlier health issues compared to a varied hunter-gatherer diet. It is a quiet debate about the ultimate cost of convenience. But for now, the warm, fragrant loaf represents simple, quiet abundance. You let your eyes gently scan the warm, earthy dwelling. The fire is slowly banking down, the intense light fading back to a soft, orange glow. The kneading stone is cool again. The whole process, from the slow grind of the grain to this final, comforting rest, has been a deep lesson in patience. a cycle completed with quiet, focused intention. The smell of the Neolithic sourdough bread is the reward, a warm, tangible promise of a successful, quiet day. You gently reach out and tap the side of the crust. The sound is a hollow, firm knock-knock, the sound of perfection. Now, the fire is just a soft, low glow on the hearth, and the heavy, fragrant loaf of einkorn sourdough is finally cooling on the stone. The air is still and carries the deep, comforting scent of baked grain and subtle wood smoke. You are completely still, your entire being settled and quieted by the long, repetitive rhythms of the bake. Feel the lingering warmth in the room, that soft, dry heat that keeps the shadows gentle and blurred. The long journey, from the scratch of the hand, quern to the final crackle of the crust, is over. Let the last of the day's worries, those small, sharp edges of modern life, soften and fade like the light of the dying fire. The sounds around you are minimal now, maybe a faint, steady hum from the ventilation, or the distant, soft shove of the night air. Focus only on the weight of your own body, settling deeper into the bed, sinking gently into the pillows. Let the peaceful memory of the slow, steady kneading, the quiet patience of the rising dough, and the powerful, reassuring scent of ancient bread be the only thoughts remaining. You are safe, you are warm, and you are surrounded by the quiet certainty of history. There is no rush to sleep, only a gentle, slow invitation. Your eyes feel heavy, your shoulders are completely relaxed, and your breath is long and shallow. Just keep floating on this feeling of complete stillness and warmth, letting the quiet peace of the Neolithic hearthstone carry you down into a deep, deep and gentle rest. Sleep now.